Now, for those of you who are unaware, our class has been going through a series through Hebrews basically for almost a year now. And we've been building and building and building and building. And once you get to Hebrews chapter 12, you're at the author's main point. Everything that he's been leading up to is culminated right here in chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. But to put this in a little bit of a broader context, what I would like to do is take you back to the end of chapter 10. And so at the end of chapter 10, the author's just got done encouraging his audience to remember their former persecution, to remember their prior experiences, and to resolve within themselves to be faithful. And then he ends chapter 10 in verse number 38 when he makes a comparison. He says, "Now the just shall live by faith, but if any man draw back, my soul shall have no pleasure in him." And then he finishes with, "But we are not of them who draw back unto perdition, but of them that believe to the saving of the soul." Now in verse 38, we've got two groups of people. We've got one group over here, and we'll call these guys, well, no, I'll put the just over here. So we have the just. I'm left-handed, so my just go on my left side. So we have this group are the just. These are the people that are living by faith, right? And then we have this group of people who are turning back. Which group is God pleased with?
Which group what?
Which group is God pleased with? This one. The group that's living by faith, right? And then we get to chapter 11, and the author gives us a running definition of faith. And the way we define faith is a believing response to God's word that results in action. And so this would be somebody hears God, whether in the Old Testament was direct or through a vision or whatever, or us now through the scriptures. We see what God has said, we believe in it, and it leads to an obedient responsive action. And that definition is played out throughout the entire chapter of chapter 11. And what you find in chapter 11 is you have this big group of people that the author is going to call witnesses. And this group of people, to varying degrees, showed faith in what God had told them. Again, to varying degrees. Like you could go up, you could look through the examples, you could see somebody like Abraham, and you could like, oh, this is a faithful man. This is a man who heard what God had to say, believed in it, and his life shows evidence that he acted in accordance with what he believed. When you get down later in the list, you get to people like Samson and Gideon, you might scratch your head a little bit. It's like, wait a minute. You go read in the book of Judges, which is the toilet bowl of the Bible, and you get to Samson, you get to Gideon, and you're like, these were not people who lived lives of faith. And so you have a little bit of a conundrum there. But we recognize that faith is a believing response to what God says, even if somebody as weak as Gideon, somebody as cowardly as Gideon was, someone as fearful as he was, or someone as completely profane as Samson was, both of them, at least in one moment of their life, had a believing response to what God said. And so we have this entire group of witnesses that is a testament to us of what happens to individuals if they choose to believe and be faithful to God. And so when you get to verse 1, it says, we're seeing we are also compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses. There's two general interpretations to what this cloud of witnesses is doing. The first one is the feel-good one, which is you could think of everyone in a stadium, for example. We're going to be playing the race analogy really heavily here. And so imagine you're in a stadium, right? And you're about to run a race. Who would the witnesses be? The spectators, right? Okay. So if you adopt that interpretation, basically what you've got is a heavenly, we'll call it a Super Bowl, since it's Super Bowl Sunday, why not? We'll play with it. So you've got a dome or an amphitheater or something packed full of a bunch of Old Testament witnesses that are looking down on earth and cheering us on. That's not actually what it's talking about, but it is a nice thing to think about, I suppose. And so when we take that approach, we actually take it backwards. So who are the witnesses in chapter 12, verse 1? This great cloud of witnesses. It's not a trick question. Okay. So in context, this great cloud of witnesses is going to be an entire group of people listed in chapter 11. And so what are they witnesses to? Okay, let me stop asking questions. Everyone in the back hearing me okay? Am I loud enough? Lucas? Okay. All right. Right, exactly. Now, David said faith, right? Or somebody said faithfulness, right? Okay, Calvin did. Somebody out there said that. Because she signed faithful, so I'm going to assume somebody said that. Exactly that. What we have is an entire chapter, chapter 11, of a group of people that are witnesses to the fact that, one, God is faithful, because it mentions in 11 verse 6 that God is faithful, a rewarder of them who diligently seek him, which speaks of God's faithfulness and interactiveness with the people that are trying to believe on him. It's also a witness to the fact that God's faithful to keep his promises. But it's also a testament of a group of people who, throughout whatever circumstances they faced to varying degrees, were faithful to God. And that's important because this great cloud of witnesses that have compassed about us, they're not the spectators in a theater looking down from heaven in the heavenly Superdome or wherever and cheering us on while we all run around in circles and run our race. What this is, this could be thought of like a group of statues. Like when you go into a Cowboys stadium, I would assume, has statues like Troy Aikman or Emmitt Smith, or I'm not a Cowboys fan, so I would assume there's statues out in front of that, right? No, there's not? Wow, I should stop making assumptions.
They have their names on them.
Okay, all right. But there's a place somewhere in the world, I'm going to keep making a fool out of myself here. There's a place somewhere in the world where when you go into an amphitheater or something, you have either names or you have statues of the greats, right? And those statues of the greats aren't a witness to them looking at you when you walk by them. What they're a witness to is this is a person who did what they did well. And so if we're going to be like a Cowboys fan, and I hate the Cowboys, but we'll do it anyway because we're in Dallas, we're in Fort Worth. And if we're going to be a Cowboys fan, we would have a statue of like Troy Aikman, right? A quarterback who did his job well. I forget how many Super Bowls he won in the early 90s. Okay, we would have Emmitt Smith, right? You would have a Jay Novacek or a Michael Irvin. And you have all these great people. What made them great and what made them a witness, and what the reason why people build statues of these people is because they've run their race well. They have done what they did well. Emmitt Smith was one of the greatest running backs that ever played. Like, he was a great running back. He did what he did well. And he is a witness to anybody else that's going to come along behind him and go, hey, I want to be a great running back. They're going to look to somebody like an Emmitt Smith. They're going to look to somebody like a Troy Aikman, or take your pick. They're going to look to somebody who is great, who was a forerunner that went on before them. But what's interesting about this is the author is telling us to run our race, right? Which we'll define that in a moment. But he doesn't tell us to look at the great heroes of the faith. So he lists all these people in chapter 11 of witnesses to God's faithfulness and witnesses to a life that's lived in light of believing in the promises of God, and that are witnesses of their faithfulness to God. And the author says, yeah, seeing how we have this great cloud of witnesses, who is he telling us to look to? Right, he's telling us to look to Jesus. Okay, we'll get into that in a moment, but first of all, we're going to dive really heavily into this running a race analogy, because the author is like beating a dead horse with this thing. And so, what does it mean to run our race? What is the Christian race?
Living your life according to the gospel.
Okay. Good. Anyone else?
Press forward to the prize of the goal of the upward calling which is in Christ Jesus.
Good. Anyone else?
Thankfulness.
Good. Perfect. You all pass. And so the way I've defined it, and I pulled this from a commentator because I thought it was really good, the Christian race is living the Christian life of faithful endurance amidst hostility. Now you have to remember with this group of believers back then that the author was writing to, they weren't enduring easy times. Like they didn't have, it wasn't peaches and cream and butterflies and lollipops with them. Like they had already gone through about a severe persecution and affliction, and they were either in the midst of one or they were getting ready to go into another bout. And because of that, they were looking at all the situations around them. They were questioning to themselves, is it worth it to be faithful? Is there any reason why I should be faithful? Why are you two laughing? Okay. I'm going to move on. And so it's, I don't even know where I was. Where was I?
Was it running the race? Big faith.
Right. So our race, their race, specifically called for them to go through bouts of suffering, for example, bouts of affliction, bouts of persecution. And so what he's doing is the author's got a group of people, and they are weary, they are tired, they're ready to throw in the towel. And he uses the greatest analogy ever, says, hey, you guys are runners in a race. Keep running forward. And then he says, run your race with patience. And the question is, why do we need patience? First of all, what even is patience, and why do we need it?
It takes time to accomplish anything well. To do a good job takes time. Time requires patience. You can't instantly become anything.
Okay, good. Calvin?
You are expecting good things to come in the future. It's been talking about faith before. We're expecting we've been given eternal life, and that Jesus will do all these things for us. But in this life, we have to endure. And he's using the race analogy, is saying finish strong even though things are going to be hard, and just to keep enduring.
Good. There's two ways to define patience. There's the way that I normally think of patience, where you're just going to endure something, you're just going to grin and bear it, right? We've all been in there, right?
Yeah.
Like there's a situation you don't like, and you're just going to sit there, you're going to grin, and you're going to bear it. That's one definition. That's actually not necessarily what it's talking about here. So keep it with our analogy of a runner. So let's say that you are preparing to run a race, which this makes a lot more sense when I'm talking to our class. I don't know if any of you are long-distance runners or have been in the past or anything like that, but I would assume most of us here are not actually preparing, Calvin. I would assume most of us here are not preparing to run a long-distance race, so let's pretend that we were.
Our life is a long-distance race, dear.
Fair enough. And so let's pretend we're physically going to prepare ourselves to run a long-distance race. The type of endurance we need, is it the one that just sits back and will patiently accept it? Or is it the type of endurance that I am going to persevere even though my entire body is aching and agonizingly in pain, but I have this finish line ahead of me, and I'm going to be focused specifically on that no matter what I have to endure? Which type of patience is it talking about here? Yeah, exactly. And so what he's calling his audience to do then is continue to be faithful. You have a Christian life. Now the Christian life, once you are saved, you have a fixed starting point. And so the gun is fired, you take off, right? Now, some of us are further along than others. Some of us are closer to the end than others. But all of us have an individual race that we are running. And I completely lost my train of thought. Okay, so we have a fixed starting point. Once you are saved, you have a fixed ending point. All of us are going to end up here no matter how well we run in between. And so you have a fixed start and you have a fixed end. What the author is concerned about in the book of Hebrews is this entire spot in the middle. What he is concerned about is how well his audience is going to run. And so he adds things in the book. He reminds them to be faithful to God. He reminds them of God's faithfulness. He includes past examples of faithfulness and unfaithfulness from the Old Testament to encourage his audience to stay faithful to God. And then he builds it up by just pointing them to Christ with what Christ did. And then he gets to the point to where he's like, look unto Jesus. Like if you were going to run your race, if you're going to be a runner, back then, you threw off everything. If you're going to run a race, what's the point of running a race? Why do we enter races?
To win.
To win, right? We want to cross the finish line. And if I am a runner and I want to cross the finish line, there's some things that I have to do. Like if I'm going to run, and I need to do more of this just personally, you got to cut back on the calories. Like you don't generally see heavy-set runners. And if they start off heavy-set after they have run for a while, they're not heavy-set anymore. And so if I'm going to run well, I got to cut the carbs. I got to cut back on the calories. I got to eat properly. I have to discipline my body because my goal in this race is to cross the finish line. And therefore, what I do is I am looking ahead to that finish line, and anything else that is preventing me or hindering me from running well, I put aside. That's what it's talking about laying aside every weight. So if I have a weight, weights will slow me down. And so the runners back then, before they got into a race, they would enter the amphitheater, and they would have these really heavy robes on that showed, hey, I am a runner. When that race started, they weren't running with those robes. They cast that off. They ran with as little clothing as possible because anything they could to get an edge, anything they could to win that race, anything they thought that might slow them down went to the wayside. And the author is asking Christians to run their life, to live their life of faithfulness to God, no matter what happens, in that exact same way. So when it says, lay aside the weights that so easily beset us, using the analogy of a runner casting aside things that slow him down, if he's focused on a finish line, and the Christian's finish line is Christ, because we're looking unto Christ, then the weights that easily beset us is anything that's going to hinder us from running well. And that's going to take a different form in every person's life, and I'll admit that, so we don't need to go into like trivialities with it. Well, I'm not going to, it's not the point. The point is when you analyze your life, and you're being called to a life of faithfulness to God, God has spoken, you believe what he says, you're going to live a life of faithfulness to him, then the things that get in your way, the things that constantly conflict, those things have to go by the wayside if you want to run well. And then the other thing, it says, lay aside the weights that so easily beset us. Let us lay aside every weight and the sin which thus so easily beset us. And the word beset there means to entangle. So can keep it with the runner analogy. If he's running with his robes on, and they're these long flowing robes, what's going to happen to this guy?
You're going to trip.
He's going to trip on it, right? Mm-hmm. He's going to fall over. He's going to fall flat on his face. And everyone's going to mock him for it. And rightfully so. And so in our case, the author doesn't specify a particular sin that he's concerned about. He just uses a broad category of sin. And so he's not concerned about necessarily a specific sin in somebody's life. He is calling each individual that's going to read this book or that was hearing it preached the first time to take an inventory of their life and go, is there something in your life that is sinful that's going to cause you to stumble and going to cause you to trip? All up until this point in the book, he has been warning his audience over and over and over again to pay attention to what God has to say. Don't depart away from God in an evil heart of unbelief. And so his whole focus, if God is here, this is Jesus, and we're looking at Jesus, he wants us to be right here. Anything other than that would be that. That's the entire book of Hebrews in 3 sides. And so what he's wanting is his audience to stay faithful. And the only way that they can stay faithful is by eliminating the things that might impair them to their faithfulness. And then the way we're supposed to run our race is to look unto Jesus. So you can think of Jesus in a couple different ways in this text. One is he's kind of the goal. Like if we're running, everyone focuses on the goal. They focus on crossing the finish line. And so if we're focusing on Jesus, then he serves as sort of as a representative of that finish line. And so if I'm going to look straight at Jesus and I am running well, I am running faithful to what he has to say, but if I get my eyes on something else, what happens to me? If I'm running a race and I'm looking all over the place,
you lose focus.
Your eyes are not on the finish line.
exactly, which is going to impede how I run, correct?
Slow you down.
Or cause me to stumble and fall out completely, which is what the author was concerned about here. And so it calls Jesus the author and the finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross. Is that my... No? Okay, cool. We got time. So it calls Jesus the author and finisher of our faith, and then it tells us how he ran his race. It is 10 o'clock for those of you who need to greet. And so let's talk about this, the author and finisher of our faith, because this is pretty interesting. And so the word author, and I'm not going to pronounce the Greek words because I don't speak Greek. Not even going to try.
I understand it anyway.
And so when you go in the book of Hebrews, it's not the first time this word pops up. This word pops up all the way back in Hebrews chapter 2, verse 10, where it calls Jesus the captain of our salvation. So that word captain and the word author are the same Greek word. And what this word entails, in keeping with our race analogy, because the author is beating this race analogy really hard in these 3 verses. In verse 4, he switches to a boxing analogy of all things. But we're going to go with the race analogy. So Jesus is the captain. He is the author of our faith. That word means the pioneer. It means somebody who has gone on before with the expectation that a group of people are going to follow him. And so Jesus, as the author of our faith, came down from heaven, took on humanity, took on flesh, became human, and showed us how to run that race. He modeled the life of faithfulness that every Christian is supposed to aspire to follow. And so as the author of our faith, we're looking unto Jesus because we see how Jesus ran his race. And we'll get into that in a minute. But let's go on to the finisher of our faith. And so finisher, it means bring to completion. And so Hebrews has a very strong emphasis on the idea of perfection. And this idea of perfection means to bring it about and to fulfill a goal. And so we have a goal in mind and we're striving to it, which for Christ, what was Christ's goal? Why was he incarnated? Why did he come to earth?
Save lost sinners.
Right. And how did he do that?
Being faithful to what God wanted him to do.
All the way until the cross, right? And so Jesus came down, it says, for the joy set before him. Jesus is running his race here. And for the joy set before him, he knows what's going to happen when his race is complete. He knows he is going to be exalted to the right hand of the Father.
Right. Not only did he run the race, but once the race was run, he become the finish line for the rest of us.
Exactly that. Exactly that. And so Jesus comes down and he runs this race. Now, was his race, this is going to sound a little bit trite, so forgive me. Was his race easy?
No.
Well, what did he face when he was running his race?
Every temptation we faced.
Okay, so the sin that we're supposed to lay aside, he faced. And he laid that aside perfectly, correct?
Right.
Okay, what else did he face?
Death.
He faced death. He had to die.
Persecution, similar to what the Hebrews were facing.
Persecution, exactly. The opposition, in this case, the contradiction of sinners against himself. So when Jesus was running his race, he comes down and he goes, "A body thou hast prepared for me, I delight to do thy will, O God." So Jesus is perfectly fulfilling the will of the Father throughout his entire life. And he faces opposition and obstacle after obstacle and persecution after persecution, whether that was from his own followers that sometimes opposing him, or his family opposing him, or the religious rulers opposing him, or the entire weight of Rome and all the armies of hell are arrayed against Jesus. And he is faithfully running his race in perfect, complete submission and obedience to the Father. And when he finishes his race, he dies on a cross. He raises from the dead 3 days later, and now he's installed as our great high priest at the right hand of the Father. Which means the salvation that we have in Jesus is as secure as Jesus is as the right hand of the Father. So if you're ever questioning whether we can lose our salvation or not, you can ask yourself the question, is anyone capable of going up into heaven and taking Jesus off the throne?
No.
That you are not capable of losing your salvation. It's as secure as Christ is on the throne. But that doesn't mean that we can't run our races poorly, which is why the author is encouraging his audience, trying to keep them faithful to looking into Jesus. Because look, races are tiring, are they not? Life gets weary. I would assume the older you get, the more weary it gets.
Amen.
And then the more you want to live faithfully for Christ, the more you're going to endure opposition from everybody else around you. And so we have these things called suffering. We have this thing called trials. We have this thing called opposition. All these things are arrayed against us to prevent us from running our race, which is why the call to faithfulness is so important. And the way you can stay faithful when you're running your race is you got to look into Jesus. You got to remember what he did. Because if you don't remember what he did, if you don't encourage yourself by looking at Jesus as the example, you look at Jesus as the finish line, Jesus is the one we can cry out to for help in time of need, as it says in chapter 4 of the book. If you're not looking unto Jesus, you're looking off somewhere else. If you're going to run your race, you're going to end up sidetracked. You're going to end up in a ditch somewhere. And what's going to happen is the author is going to tell you, he's going to tell you, consider him, talking about Jesus in verse 3, consider Jesus that endured such contradiction of sinners against himself. The word consider there means to calculate. It means think about it. Think about what Jesus has done for you. Think about how Jesus ran his race. Think about all of the opposition he faced. And yet he perfectly submitted to the Father, even through suffering. Suffering was not an obstacle to him. He was willing to be obedient to the Father, even enduring suffering, because of that joy that was set before him. And if you're not going to consider that when you endure suffering, you're enduring trials and hardship and things like that, you're like, man, is a Christian life even worth living at this point? Because all I've got is opposition. I try to live like a Christian, and then my life goes downhill from there. Because being a Christian makes life worse. It makes life harder. And the reason it makes life harder is because all of a sudden everything else that was just around you that didn't care about you at all, wasn't pushing against you, all of a sudden hates you. Right. And so now you have demonically inspired things working against you. Now you feel the weight of oppression. Now you feel the weight of things happening that you know aren't right, but you can't do anything about them. And so you have to endure while you're running your race, so you have to suffer the abuse and the persecution, everything else that's going to happen. Because you can't change that. The world is run by the devil, and a world run by the devil is going to be hostile to Christians. Right. There's nothing we can do about that. And so the goal then is, rather than sit there and go, oh, wait, this entire world is arrayed against me, therefore I think I'm not going to run my race. I'm not going to cross the finish line. The goal then is to continue to be faithful, to continue to run that race, because what joy are we looking forward to? The joy of Jesus was reconciled sinners to himself that could go with him into heaven for all eternity and be with Christ until whenever eternity ends. What is the joy we're looking forward to? What's the reward at our finish line?
To go to heaven to be with Jesus.
So that's our great hope, right? And so if we have that hope, can we endure anything that happens here? Although the enduring will get incredibly painful. And if I'm down here next week, we're going to talk about that, because the very next section of Hebrews is going to talk about how God uses persecution and how God uses suffering to grow us unto holiness. And so we think of trials as these horrible things, because nobody likes being in a trial. I mean, I don't like it. Maybe you're a masochist, but I'm not. I don't like trials. I don't like suffering. I don't like pain. But that's the world we live in. I cannot change those things. And if God is going to use those things to grow me into holiness, then I can submit myself to those things, even though that might not be what God wants. I mean, God doesn't want people to persecute each other. It's not an endorsement for God that people persecute you. God is against those things, but that doesn't mean God cannot use it for your own good. And so if you aren't considering Jesus, you're not looking at Christ, you don't have your eyes focused on Jesus, what will happen is verse number 3, it talks about, consider him, lest ye be wearied and faint in your minds. So have you all ever watched people cross the finish line of like a marathon or a sprint or a 13.1K? What do they look like when they cross that finish line?
Exhaustion.
Right. They have their hands on their knees, they're gasping for breath, they're falling over, they're falling all over the place because they're done. Well, that's what weary and faint in your mind means. And so what he's worried about is his audience, before they ever get to the finish line, are just going to fall over because they're tired, they're exhausted, they can no longer endure. They're like, we have run our race, but this is as far as we're going, and then they fall out of the way. And then when they die, they get to heaven, they haven't finished well. And so they can't go, and God said, well, done, thou good and faithful servant, because they weren't good and they weren't faithful. Because they fainted and they quit before they ever got there. And so the goal of this book is to encourage a weary audience to continue to be faithful to God, to continue to believe what he has to say, to continue to be faithful and obedient to him, even if it means suffering, even if it means persecution or affliction, because that faithful running is going to allow you to finish across the finish, to make it across the finish line, just like Christ did. It's not going to be perfect because we're all sinners. And so we're not going to run with perfection like Christ did. But Christ can come and promises if we will cry out to him to help, he can come down and strengthen us to help us to continue running. So the goal of the book of Hebrews is, in light of the fact that you are enduring opposition, you're enduring affliction, everything is arrayed against you, keep running. Because what's waiting for you after the race is done is worth it. It's far greater than any toil or any pain that you're experiencing now. And so since my wife is pregnant, I guess we could use a pregnancy analogy. I have heard, now you can correct me if I am wrong, I've made a fool of myself multiple times. I have heard once the baby is born, the lady tends to forget about the previous trauma they just went through because they now have the baby. To a certain degree, right? Okay, Natalie did not. Does that actually happen? No?
Years later.
Okay. But you crossed the finish line.
Yes.
And now you have the joyful bundle in your arms. Was the trauma and the pain and everything else like that worth it? And so if we're going to be a runner and run our race, we're going to train ourselves and discipline ourselves and push through, even though our bones, our muscles and everything are in agony the entire time, because what we see at the end of the finish line is worth it. They're racing for a corruptible crown. They get this little wreath of leaves that'll go away. What we're racing for is something of far greater value. What we have at the finish line is Christ waiting for us. Amen. Therefore, let's be patient. When we encounter the affliction and the persecution and suffering, and we can even boil it down to physical pain and trauma. Like, we can boil it down to the smallest of things. Don't let those things distract you from the fact that we are still running a race and our faithfulness to God is still required of us. When we're done with our race, at that point we can fall over and collapse in exhaustion because our race is finished. I don't think it's going to work that way because we'll be in heaven. I don't think we'll be exhausted in heaven. But to follow the analogy, you could collapse in victory once you have crossed the finish line. Don't give up too soon. And so that's basically Hebrews 12, 1 through 3. We could talk about a lot more, but time's up. And so for those of you who are going to be on our class next week, we're going to cover verses 4 through 11. And we're going to talk about a really interesting subject about how God uses persecution and suffering in our lives to grow us into holiness. And so for those of you who are going to be there, you can look forward to that. For those of you who are not, you can look forward to Pastor. Hopefully he's better by next Sunday.